Golden State Media Concepts Sci-Fi Podcast. Together we dive into the world of sci-fi and science fiction. From episodes of Star Trek, Star Wars, to The Walking Dead, Resident Evil, all the hot new science fiction movies from the back doors of Marvel or DC. The Golden State Media Concepts Sci-Fi Podcast. You'll never look at science fiction the same way again.
Brought to you by the GSMC Podcast Network. My name is Keith, and I am your host for this wonderful Sunday. I hope y'all are enjoying it. It's definitely starting to get nice over here in California. It rained yesterday a little bit, which is a little odd for us in May, basically June. Small talk, talking about the weather on a podcast. That's that's what we're here to do, right? Not going to talk about anything science fiction-y. Definitely not going to talk about the second part of the ending of Hyperion or the beginning of the new book. I would never do that. That's not true. That's exactly what we're doing today. I last week said that we were, not going to we were going to maybe move on from Hyperion, but I could not help myself. I really love this book. So I kind of decided to use my Audible credit to get the next one in the series. There are 4 books. So I apologize if you are not loving Hyperion. You may be in for a little bit of a ride because I think I'm going to keep talking about it for a while. I'm very interested to see what Simmons does with this universe. And to see, or I was interested, now I kind of know. How he's going to handle the second book. Is it going to be the same chapter structure? Is it going to feel a similar way? All of those sorts of things were questions that I had. But prior to getting to that, prior to getting the second book, I want to kind of finish off the discussion that I was having during the first book. Just because I feel like I was kind of maybe being a little bit myopic in my viewpoint of what the point of the book was. My viewpoint of what the point was. That's a sentence. So I thought that it would be a good idea for us to kind of further explore the ending of the first book as well as talk about the epilogue, because the epilogue, it has a lot to say as well. And after listening to the first couple chapters of the next book, I am thinking that the first book is kind of like the magnum opus of the series. It seems that it's the one that's the most based in a specific type of stylistic choice. It feels a little bit more intentional in everything that it's doing. I can see why it won a Hugo Award, and I don't think the rest of them won any awards. It doesn't feel like the book was intended to be a complete story. I feel like it is supposed to feel a little bit open-ended at the end. Just because open-ended at the end, man, I am full of bad sentences today. Just because it does kind of complete a series of thoughts and allegories and interesting statements, but at the same time kind of leaves things for interpretation, but also doesn't resolve the meta-narrative. And that's the big reason that I am super interested in in reading the books that come after the first book, is because the meta-narrative of this book goes so many different and interesting directions that I just really felt like there's not a way for me to encapsulate, or for me to figure out exactly what it is that Simmons is trying to say or what his intentions are with the book if I don't listen to read in air quotes, the other books of the series. the first book ends with the characters having gotten just to the edge of the time tombs, and they don't interact with the Shrike. And I'm wondering how long into the second book Simmons is going to wait until they do interact with the Shrike. I am 5 chapters in, and they haven't interacted with it just yet. In fact, it's been a lot of nothing as far as interactions on Hyperion are concerned, which was something I was kind of nervous about because I felt like a lot of what made the book really great is that kind of like Jaws effect that he's able to capture by creating this huge monstrosity and evil thing that's associated with like a bunch of really awful stuff, like the cruciform, they call it a resurrection parasite, which it kind of, we talked about this in the first chapter. Every time you get resurrected, you lose a little bit of the self. And so it was kind of like a commentary, like a metaphoric and like literal representation of what it would look like to be able to have immortality. So, it definitely is interesting to see how he's handling all of these like really profound concepts in the second book. But it feels like a lot of it's going to be kind of like tying in the overall, like why it is that Hyperion is so important and things like that to the universe, which is good because we don't really get a firm answer about that, even though the answer is kind of like, well, we don't know why it's important, but it is important because it represents something unknown. So not only do we not know why it's important, but we don't know why it's important because we don't know anything about it. So actually it's important because we don't know anything about it, and we also don't know anything about it or know why it's important. So I think it's kind of like this weird, probably a statement on truth, if I'm being super honest. It's probably kind of like what Dan Simmons is trying to say that like we as human beings do in the world when we interact with things, and making statements about whether or not what it is that we believe as being true is actually true. And if it is true, how would we even know if it was true? And how would we know if we've gotten at what is true about it? And so I think that that's kind of something that Simmons is going for. But a really big part of the first book, as I had mentioned last week, or rather Wednesday, is this idea of like ignorant mindfulness in some capacity. So the book, the last chapter is the consul's tale, and when we do get his name, I don't remember what it is right now. It's like Aaron or something like that. But his grandmother's name is Siri, and Siri is the namesake of a rebellion that occurred on a planet that was originally trying to be incorporated into the hegemony called the Maui Covenant. And the Maui Covenant is a like spiritual successor to like Hawaii and the Pacific Islands. And so Simmons uses the conflict that was experienced by colonials and natives, specifically in Hawaii, in order to kind of like portray why Maui Covenant didn't want to be associated into the hegemony. And that's where this kind of idea, that's where the really predictive part of this novel or of this series comes in. Like I said, I'm not that far into the second book. I'm only 5 chapters in, so I don't really know exactly where he's going to take it from there. But my thought is that Simmons seems pretty against this idea of like a mindless consumption. And specifically in Silenus chapter, when we are listening to Silenus' tale, because Silenus is so old, he kind of watches civilization go from like through different stages of technological advancement. And I think this is the part where Simmons is getting really predictive. And I kind of mentioned that in that particular episode, but just kind of want to tie it in with the rest of the novel. So he mentions that people are on the whole more likely to be illiterate than they are to be literate, because the consumption of specific types of media has been reduced because of ease of access via other means. So everything can become like a video or be directly input into your mind through different like implants and things like that. And so he is kind of commenting on the fact that like our attention spans are getting shorter and people are stopping. They're not reading as often, which is, kind of ironic because I didn't read the book. I listened to it in an audiobook form. So I'm kind of like playing into this commentary that Simmons is making that individuals don't read. And if you don't read, you lose that skill. And I think that Simmons definitely feels that reading creates a specific type of engagement from the general populace. And this is something that science fiction authors use all the time when it comes to post-apocalyptic literature or predictive literature. And we're going to talk more about that right after this first quick commercial break.
Want to find out what movies to go see? Then check out the GSMC Movie Podcast. It's your ticket to the latest movies, whether it's a new blockbuster event, romantic, comedy, or action flick. This show has got it all covered. They talk some what to go see now. Don't bother. What's hot on Netflix and everything in between. That's gsmcpodcast.com/movie-podcast. When it's all about the movies, it has to be this new show. Don't forget to like them on Facebook and follow them on Twitter. Visit gsmcpodcast.com for more info.
The trope of, or the habit that a lot of science fiction authors have, they're kind of like more predictive tendencies as far as like the way that they write their science fiction is concerned. So a lot of authors kind of get into this area of like predicting what it is the future might look like. Most frequently that's dystopian. Even when they try to play it as utopian, it is ultimately kind of dystopian in comparison to what we are talking about, or in comparison to what we know nowadays. And a big part of that is kind of like because of the presence of new knowledge. So like Minority Report is predicting that eventually people will mutate the ability to be psychic, and so it becomes this despotic government dystopia because they start predicting who's going to commit crimes and then arresting them in advance and things like that. So because of the presence of knowledge that is alien or an ability that is alien to us as individuals in our current contexts, we are unable to fathom that as being something that would be desirable. So that's that. But as far as literature is concerned, Simmons is specifically kind of harps on, like I mentioned in the chapter of Silenus's tale, as well as other things. He kind of touches a little bit on this in the tale with Saul Weintraub, when he talks about the Old Testament and religion, and he touches on this with General Kassad as well. This idea that like reading and literacy are like the core tenets, the base level of critical thought, which a lot of authors do. I think it's kind of like self-inflating in a weird way, kind of like justifying themselves as being a necessity within society. And I don't necessarily disagree with that hypothesis. I just think it's a little bit funny, that's part of how they interpret or view themselves. But specifically, I kind of wanted to compare like the predictions of this particular novel to predictions of other novels, and just kind of show how there are certain tropes that Simmons is doing better than other people. So like Fahrenheit 451 is a great example, because reading books is pretty much literally banned unless it's like literature that's been approved of by the state. And so Guy Montague, I believe, is literally going around burning books in giant piles, and he's a firefighter, and the history books say that firefighters always use fire to fight, to impart violence and destroy things. But like the reality that we know, obviously, is that firefighters used to fight fires and put them out rather than start them. So I just find it really I find that really interesting. And so that like is the idea that you don't get to read is like this big point in Fahrenheit 451, and it is a huge point that is made in Silenus's tale. And it's also kind of an like it's a point that's made throughout the book in different ways. Because Simmons uses this point of people, if I say point one more time, you guys can, I don't know, pause the podcast, take a break, and be mad at me. But come right back, please. No, he uses the idea of people not reading as a way to make a statement that individuals kind of like buy things for the sake of having them, but not for the sake of consuming them, especially if they're things that are like artistic. He calls it the Pilgrim's Progress idea, where everybody wants to own this specific part of culture, but not because they believe that it has something interesting or universal to offer to culture, but because someone told them that it did. And so they purchase it and then never read it. And this is what the Death of Old Earth, the book series that Silenus wrote, that got him originally wealthy when he was on Heaven's Gate, this is what happened to him. So he sells tons and tons of copies of this book, and then nobody reads it, and he wonders why the stuff that he writes afterwards doesn't sell as well. Well, it's because he kind of rode this wave of this weird phenomena at this specific time. And so this theme kind of comes up multiple times throughout the book. And I know it seems a little bit weird, and I might be drawing like a little bit, I might kind of be forcing these things together, shoehorning them together, but he, I think, is making a commentary on like the purpose of publishing, the purpose of creation as far as art is concerned throughout the entire first book of Hyperion. Because even as we get towards like the end of the chapter and he starts making all this commentary on like colonialism and things like that, I think that he is kind of making the statement that in some capacity, even art serves as a form of cultural colonialism, where there are certain parts of it that are like appropriated and then homogenized or watered down for mass consumption based off of what's going to be popular. And like a good real world illustration would be like what happened to the blues getting eventually turned, or jazz even getting turned into, jazz and 12-bar blues kind of get turned into what we now know as like rock and roll. But even more so, like standard blues progressions and church hymn progressions are what we now know for like pop songs. And so we just kind of take these things that are like quote unquote watered, or quote unquote sincere, and then water them down in order for more people to consume them. But what's funny is that the things that last are already watered down. We just don't view them as being that way because we're so distant from them, and they become like history. So if you think about it like classical music, right? We think about it as being a niche thing. Well, back when classical music was first being written, that was the pop music of the day in some capacity. It was what wealthy people who were culturally aware or culturally involved listened to. If you were poor, it was what you wanted to be able to hear because everybody else who wasn't poor got to go see it and listen to it. Whereas, like, people would kind of sing like bar ditties and things like that. And we get those bar ditties, like the national anthem is, technically a drunk song, like is a singing song from a bar. But like Pachelbel's Canon in D is the chord progression that pretty much literally every song you've ever heard uses. There are multiple like YouTube compilations, and I know it feels like we're off in the woods here, but we're really not. I promise. I'm getting to the point. A lot of Simmons' novel is kind of just like talking about the ways in which perception transforms as time moves along, and he takes it and puts it in a more grand scheme. Because we can kind of look at things in the last like 100 years, maybe 200 years if we're really trying, just because history hasn't been super well recorded. But Simmons is kind of looking at it from the perspective of like, well, now we're 800 years in the future and everything about history is well recorded. So what is it that humans continue to do, or what do they do in the future? And he kind of touches on these ideas of progress that were present in the early 1900s, which, again, Friedrich Nietzsche and Albert Camus and Sigmund Freud are all kind of philosophers and psychologists that it kind of seems like, and Simone de Beauvoir, who is superior to Camus, I don't care what anybody says, superior to Sartre. She's normally associated with being Sartre's lover, but she's the superior writer in my opinion. But hey, that's just my opinion. Take it for what it's worth. But I think there's a reason that he's kind of invoking the ideals of these individuals, because they kind of get to this point of like, there's really no such thing as human progress. And a big part of that is because of World War I. And so we get this really like interesting dynamic of what would that look like 500 years in the future if we had been able to record everything that happened and we could like cite things rather than just saying, oh, that's old history. We don't really know exactly what happened because we lost the records. So we're going to keep talking about this subject right after this next quick commercial break.
Tired of searching the vast jungle of podcasts? Now listen close and hear this out. There's a podcast network that covers just about everything that you've been searching. Hey! The Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network is here. Nothing less than a podcast bliss with endless hours of podcast coverage. From news, sports, music, fashion, cooking, entertainment, fantasy, football, and so much more. So stop lurking around and go straight out to the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. Guaranteed to fill that podcast itch. Whatever it may be. Visit us at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Follow us on Facebook and Twitter, and download us on iTunes, SoundCloud, and Google Play.
Don't worry, I'll switch it up after the next commercial break. Right before the break, we were talking about this idea of how Simmons is kind of making a commentary on how almost everything that humans do kind of serves as some form of like colonialism in some capacity. I had mentioned that, or I had mentioned the story that the consul tells in the last chapter about the Maui Covenant planet that he is from. I had mentioned that his grandmother's name is Siri, and there is a rebellion named Siri's Rebellion. And Siri's Rebellion is this like really violent and bloody conflict that occurs on this planet when the original colonists rebel against the hegemony. And the hegemony is kind of like, I think the best way that it's described in the book is like a hive in some capacity, like this unknowing hive mind that doesn't realize that it's a hive mind, but it actually is a hive mind. And to kind of like talk about the human race as generally being a hive mind is like a really interesting comparison, in my opinion. I mean, obviously it's interesting, that's why I'm bringing it up. But I think that the really interesting thing about it, is that we kind of are. If you look at like what's popular in specific areas and things like that, there's always kind of like a common trope, and then there's generally like an ostracizing? I don't know. There's generally like a rejection of the type of people who don't like certain things that are popular. And I can say this as someone who really doesn't like kind of fit into the norms. There's like a general idea that you're not normal. And so there's this weird unspoken social pressure that occurs to make yourself fit within a specific type of like bubble. And I don't know that this is something that Simmons is trying to talk about specifically, but I think that like the common thread amongst everybody who is on the pilgrimage is that they've been forced to become aware of some aspect of their life that they took for granted in some capacity, or that they took as being a given. And, you know, I talk about all the time how I might be projecting like my own personal views onto like the meaning of this novel, and I'm sure that like Simmons would probably say like, oh, that wasn't my intent. But something like a conclusion that we might be able to draw from this book when we're looking at the overall meta-narrative is like, well, why are all these people on this pilgrimage specifically? And it's not like most of them, actually not most of them, like 2 or 3 of them have never interacted with the Shrike. Braun Lamia never interacted with the Shrike. Saul Weintraub never directly interacted with the Shrike. And the Consul didn't even really make mention of the Shrike or of Hyperion in any capacity other than the fact that he is decidedly against this like colonization, this like slow absorption of planets into the hegemony. And I had kind of briefly mentioned this idea last week where Simmons is saying that like under like aquatic mammals have some sort of like quasi sentience, because in that chapter he's specifically able to, the Consul's grandfather is specifically able to have a conversation with the dolphins of Maui Covenant. And the dolphins of Maui Covenant are kind of like the big reason that there is this rebellion to not join the hegemony, because the hegemony is going to come in and be like, hey, welcome to the hegemony. We are going to open up all these avenues of trade for you. We're going to make life better for you. And what they're going to do is kind of like subtly very evil. A lot of people might not think of it as this way, but I think I know Simmons does this intentionally. He's definitely making a commentary on what a lot of civilized countries did to less civilized countries, where they came in and, you know, they wanted oil, or they wanted to put tourist attractions up. And this is why I think he uses Maui Covenant and Hawaii specifically as examples of this type of colonialism. Because when Siri asks the Consul's grandfather, Marin, you know, what's going to happen when the Farcaster portal opens, he says, well, you're going to get a bunch of, like, tycoons and moguls, and then tourists, and then military forces. And, like, that's pretty much exactly the order. Maybe switch military forces and tourists around, but that's pretty much exactly the order of like things and how they go when it comes to the way that we colonized the world around us. And so Simmons is basically saying that like when we're not aware of what it is that we do, humans kind of perpetuate this specific type of monstrousness into the future because they become woefully unaware of the past and don't realize what it is that they're doing. And we want to view them as being evil, but like, or we want to view things as being like simply, you know, this is the good side, this is the bad side, but like ultimately everybody becomes complicit in this sort of like macabre dance of quasi-morality. Like, and not that I'm saying that the people who are being imperialized have any like responsibility necessarily to stop themselves from being taken over. Oftentimes they are oppressed via like kind of shady and capricious means. And that's something that happens specifically on Maui Covenant because even though it's not like an indigenous set of people who maybe don't have an idea of what ownership is, the colonists have kind of like sold off different portions of the planet. And because it hasn't been incorporated into the hegemony, there's limitations as to what all these private investors can do planet side. But the private investors, as well as the hegemony, know that the locals, quote unquote, of a lot of Maui Covenant don't want to be incorporated because they know inevitably what's going to happen. Giant platforms are going to pop up in the middle of the oceans. They're going to destroy or kill all of the islands so that they don't move anymore, because the islands are living beings. The Consul kind of indicates that they had some sort of consciousness, right? And I'm going to get to that after I finish this topic. It'll be after the commercial break that's coming up in a minute or two here. But the colonists try to like fight against it, both in like subtle and, completely total outright fighting. And they end up losing to this giant monstrosity that is the human nature of expansion, or the nature of expansion by humans. And it's viewed as like being progress because it provides like economic means or resources or things that allow us to like expand further in this like constant state of perpetual consumption. And that is what I think Simmons is kind of trying to say, is that we just consume mindlessly, and we are not like a parasite necessarily, but we're predators without realizing that we're predators. And that is why when he makes mention specifically of the fact that the dolphins tell Marin that they miss sharks, Marin says, well, the sharks are going to come back because humans are coming, right? The people who live on Maui Covenant now, they respect the things around them in some capacity because it's this small, isolated, mindful pocket of individuals. But once the Farcaster gates open, millions and billions and trillions of people are just going to be able to cycle through instantaneously. And then all of the corporations are going to be able to mine the planet. I don't know if it's called mining, but they're going to strip the planet of its natural resources as well, because those are valuable also. And they'll just do that until there's nothing left. And this is interesting in juxtaposition to the way that they view the ousters, because, well, the ousters are considered to be barbarians because they just burn it to the ground. But it's not really all that different from what humans do. And the ousters are just, quote-unquote, evolved humans. So I think a lot of what Simmons is trying to say is everything is just kind of this like relatively evil thing that's constantly happening all around us. And the Shrike kind of represents like a retribution in some sort for that evil. So I'm going to talk more about that and also tie that whole discussion into what I was talking about before, so that you guys don't think that I'm completely crazy. That'll be right after this quick commercial break.
Watching TV has changed over time. Streaming has become the new norm. That's why Golden State Media Concepts television podcast dives headfirst to the world of cord cutting. Want to be on the loop of what's hot in Netflix? Or if it's not a preference, what about original shows in Hulu? We've got you covered. Join us as we fill in the blank and talk about movies to stream and what show you should be binging. This is the Golden State Media Concepts television podcast.
I was telling you that I was going to tie the entire discussion of what I just had for the last 20 minutes into what I was talking about in the first 10 minutes. Actually, really the second 10 minutes, I guess. So I had kind of mentioned this idea that in some capacity, science fiction is all predictive. It's all speculative on like what the future is going to look like. I had mentioned specifically Fahrenheit 451. I know that I've promised before that I wouldn't continue to bring up the same things, but I just cannot help myself, apparently. I wanted to make mention of Fahrenheit 451 specifically because it just kind of is a good example of another well-written book of speculative science fiction that kind of gets at what it is that creates a lack of mindfulness in individuals. So, like, for instance... So what's happening in Hyperion, and one of the major commentaries, I've mentioned this, a bunch, obviously. We keep talking about it. The last chapter kind of encapsulates what it is that Simmons is trying to say about what humanity does. And I think the first book is kind of designed to deliver a very specific message, but also to like set the tone for a more basic literary structure. So far, the next book in the series, the chapters are much shorter, and they are they're just as well written. It's not as if the quality of the writing has gone down. I think the purpose of the writing has changed. It's kind of shifted. And we will talk about the first few chapters of the book, after I finish up this portion of the discussion, finish up talking about the end of this particular book. We haven't even gotten to the epilogue yet. Goodness. So the things that a lot of authors write about in speculative fiction that cause lack of mindfulness are like the loss of reading and the increase in convenience. And I also would argue that there's an increase in the idea of permanence or a lack of meaning in the idea of death or loss. So, like if we look at Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep? There is this kind of disassociation that happens with loss or with temporality because of the lack of association with what is real and the inability to discern what is replicant or reploid. Sorry, I can't remember. It's been a little while. What is, not what is artificial and what is real. And that's a primary theme in Hyperion as well, where we're kind of wondering, how human are these individuals really? Well, I think Simmons' point is that no matter how distant we get from what we believe to be human, ultimately anything that's based off of the same building blocks that we are is going to do the same things that we do. And as long as we are willing to look at things as being like beneath us or, not equivalent to us based off of like alternative forms of interpretations of reality, then we're going to kind of just like artificially perpetuate ourselves into the future. Like even the artificial intelligences of the technocore in Simmons' novel are based off of the ways in which humans interact with reality. And so even they in some capacity consume and consume and assimilate. That was the word I was looking for. Assimilate the world around them into their way of life. And like they even say that, humans are kind of like the past, but the reality is they're based off of human intelligence. So there's no way for them to surpass human intelligence, quote unquote. They just kind of are like a different iteration of the same thing. So they ultimately fall victim to the same things. And so do the ousters. The ousters, it's said that they burn planets when they get there. And it's viewed as being like barbaric, but ultimately it's not any different from what the hegemony does to Maui Covenant. Because even though Maui Covenant fights back, what happens is that all the dolphins die, and the modal islands, which are living creatures, then also die. And so now you get all these like artificial islands, you get these oil rigs, you get all sorts of these other things that really are just representations of what the original thing was. And that is kind of, I think, Simmons' point, is that, as things become easier to access, as things become more and more watered down by their distance from the original, not only do they lose their authenticity, but they lose their sincerity, they lose their ability to impact. And that is something that's very heavily commented on in the publishing world in Silenus's chapter. I feel like the chapter that Simmons writes about Martin Silenus is kind of like his chapter. It's where he really puts himself in the book, because he's making all this commentary on what publishers do to original works of art and how they kind of just cannibalize them into specific portions that are more commercially viable than others. And he makes specific mention of the fact that they remove this free verse that Silenus wrote for the death of old Earth and things like that. So he's just, I think, commenting on the fact that even individuals who believe themselves to be creating something sincere are ultimately at the behest of the individuals who control the economic means, and the people who control the economic means are the ones who buy into the systems of power that are in place. And the systems of power that are in place, ultimately, no matter how much progress mankind makes, those things don't change. There's corruption, there's double crossing, there's betrayal, right? There's all these things, bribery, and they're still occurring supposedly like hundreds and hundreds of years into the future, and they're being looked at as if they're like different or new. And Simmons is kind of saying like, no, the only new thing that could possibly come from all of this is awareness. And that's why, in some weird way, that's why all of these individuals have been brought to Hyperion, because through their experiences, they were made profoundly aware of some aspect of the human experience, and they became representative of some aspect of the human experience in a way that is more archetypally sincere to what that looks like than the standard individual who lives in the hegemony. But also at the same time, they're no different than the standard individual who lives in the hegemony. And I think that that's exactly what Simmons is trying to capture, is basically saying, like, you know, even these people who think that they're super mindful are ultimately just part of the problem. And, like, we're all kind of just walking blissfully ignorant down the path of destruction, down the path of consumption, down the path of there's a fancy word for watering things down, but down the path of destroying sincerity. So we're going to take a quick commercial break, and then we're going to talk about the epilogue, and then hopefully we'll talk about the second book, just the first couple chapters of it. That'll be right after this quick commercial break.
The GSMC Life and Happiness podcast takes you on a journey of exploration. We'll discuss tried and true methods alongside the latest trends of how to best live your life to its fullest and happiest. From psychology to meditation, science to self-help books, the GSMC Life and Happiness podcast will help you to discover what makes you happy and how you can live life being the best you possible. Download the GSMC Life and Happiness podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, Google Play, or anywhere you find podcasts. Just type GSMC in the search bar.
We were kind of talking about the ending of Hyperion, the overall commentary, the ways in which history kind of just continues to perpetuate itself, and like maybe perhaps a little bit of what the Shrike represents in this novel. And I just kind of want to finish off discussing what I think the Shrike might kind of be in some capacity, at least metaphorically, to Simmons. I think that Simmons is kind of under this belief that at some point within the galaxy, there has to be some sort of balance that is, I guess, this equilibrium that occurs. Because it can't be that without the Christian God, human beings are that particularly special. And like a great example or a great reason that I think that you could make that argument is that if you take out God from the equation, then it's just kind of happenstantial that we evolved in the way that we did. And the amount of time that it would have taken us to evolve into the types of beings that we are now. And if you look at the way that the brain works and the way that our prefrontal cortex kind of manipulates things without us even knowing it, like, it's pretty obvious that, like, we kind of act out that same type of manipulation on the world around us that ourselves act out within our heads, where it's just not even realizing what we're doing. It's just all of this kind of like ignorant, not mindless, but just like not mindful interaction with the world around us. I've talked a lot on this podcast about the idea of the self and how the self kind of exists outside of conscious thought, and we kind of exist outside of reality in some capacity. good example of this is like fast food, for instance. A lot of people don't think of that as being like this evil thing, and I'm not saying that it is. I'm just saying that it's important to be mindful of these things. It's designed for us to want to eat more of it. It's literally mass-produced in a way that kind of is designed to solicit specific reactions from our bodies, and we will buy it and eat it and think like, oh, this is not, it tastes good, right? But it's objectively bad, and that's like this idea of like the self kind of telling us that we're justified in doing this thing, and then playing off of instinctual drives that we have within our heads. And that's just like the same base level instinct that any other animal operates on, and we give it the name of intelligence and claim that it has some sort of superiority, not because it actually does, but because there is this idea that is imparted on us by our prefrontal cortex that our self is more important or more valuable than everything around us. And that's an evolutionary trait. Whether you believe in God or not, whatever, and this is all just my opinion. Again, this is not a political podcast, so I'm not making statements about whether or not God is real or anything like that. I'm just saying, if you look at things from a strictly pragmatic, as much as we can logical, not to tout logic as being the best thing ever. I don't even necessarily believe that that holds enough clout to, be a good reason for anything. But if we're just looking at like A plus B equals C, like, if we as organisms were to evolve a trait that made us believe that we were in some capacity superior to other things, then we would act in a way that was more self-serving and therefore would increase the likelihood of our survival, increase the likelihood of our children's survival, increase our ability to perpetuate our existence, increase the rate of our eternality. And that idea of eternality is imparted on literally every organism that exists on this planet Earth. But we think of our idea of it as being more actualized simply because our prefrontal cortex tells us that it is. And if you take out God from that equation, then we have no justification for that. And I think that that's kind of exactly what Simmons is trying to do. We've gone out into the universe as human beings and said, we're going to take over all these planets. We're going to, consume these things. We're going to use the resources on these planets. They have petroleum. We can terraform them. Our science is so advanced. We have all these great tools. And we are the possessors of the exclusive form of sentience. And anything that does not share the same sentience as us is not worth saving. If it represents any kind of competition to us, then we destroy it. We can, and then consume what the planet has to offer. And the ousters are believed to be barbarians because they go to a planet and do the same thing, but without mining it for specific resources. So it's really just, it's tough to say is kind of the best, well, not tough to say. It's just it's a reality that and this is a reality that the console makes a point to say, is that we just destroy. Human beings just destroy because they believe themselves to be superior. And Simmons is saying, well, now we're 500 years in the future and every religion that we know of is dying and it will be extinct. And what happens then? It's the same thing that Friedrich Nietzsche was trying to propose of like, God is dead and there's not enough water in the world to wash the blood from our hands. Like, if we can say that there is no God, then what makes anything special or meaningful? Because God is what has made things special and meaningful to us as individuals, because his presence, or its presence, the presence of God, is what justifies our existence as being special. Without a purposeful creator having been the thing that set into motion what eventually actualized as a human being, then we don't have anything extra special other than slightly more electrical tissue within this thing that we call a skull. And what difference does that make in the grand scheme of existence? None. Objectively none. It's a bunch of happenstantial cells that have occurred in a specific area due to an evolutionary advantage that was created by a happenstantial situation of complete accident, that we are now perpetuating a belief of being universal or valuable. And that, I think, is exactly what Simmons is trying to get at. Like, humanity, even when they evolve into the ousters, ultimately just does the same thing. And it's all just this trick of the mind where we believe ourselves to have made this progress or to have evolved in some capacity, and ultimately we just do the same things. And the Shrike represents a retribution for that. The Shrike says that nothing is sacred, nothing is special. It is literally kind of like an embodiment of void. It even says this axiomic thing that you perceive as time is irrelevant to me, and pain is irrelevant to me. And that's what the Shrike religion is all about, is that, like, every torturous thing that the Shrike imparts on people, every murder, I wouldn't even call it murder, every destruction of human life, every alteration of human life. They say Rachel Weintraub, the girl who ages in reverse until she dies, is both the most blessed and cursed individual in the universe, and should we all be so lucky to be her? Because she is representative of what it is that the Shrike is there to do. To reverse, in some capacity, what it is that humans have done through the ignorance of their existence and the artificial preservation of what they believe to be important through a manipulation of not only themselves, but of the world around them. And that, I think, is Simmons' biggest point in this book, is that we give value to all of the most inappropriate aspects of life and all of the most inappropriate aspects of self. And in doing so, we create, or rather destroy, the type of mindfulness that would truly solicit enlightenment. And the individuals on this pilgrimage have in some capacity realized this. And after realizing it, they become alien. And then they now have to be alien and try to seek reconciliation with this thing that is even more alien than they are. So we're going to take one last quick commercial break. And then after that, I'll talk about the first 5 chapters. Actually, I'll finish talking about the epilogue. So we're not going to get to the first 5 chapters of the second book today, which I do apologize for. So we'll talk about that next week. So we'll be right back.
The Golden State Media Concepts Travel Podcast, the show that gives you advice on everything travel. We explore places you've always wanted to go, as well as giving tips for traveling in those places. We'll give you advice on the best sites for travel tips, information, and discounts. Join us as we travel the world, explore cultures, and meet new people. The Golden State Media Concepts Travel Podcast has got you covered. Download the GSMC Travel Podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, Google Play, or anywhere you find podcasts. Just type GSMC in the search bar.
Probably reference it in the next episode, because we'll be talking about the second book of Hyperion at some point in one of my next episodes. Probably not Wednesday, probably next Sunday, but we'll see. Who knows? Depends on if I can find something to watch or listen to that I think is worthy of an hour-long discussion. But I feel like I've kind of made a lot of my point about what it is that I think is most important in regards to Hyperion in general. But I wanted to talk about the epilogue specifically, because it's incredible but also awful. Mostly because you think that the epilogue is going to be like, okay, well, here's what happens when they meet the Shrike, and they don't meet the Shrike. And you're kind of like, oh, I have to read the next book, don't I, Mr. Simmons? And it's not that that's a problem. It's just that it kind of feels like his intent was to not have you do that, and that's part of why he is writing this commentary on the publication process when he's writing the chapter about Silenus. Because I think his original intention was for this to just be this giant tome of a book that you read the first one and that's it. But I think this series has like 4 books in total. I don't know if he's going to be able to keep them all this good. I seriously am doubting it, but who knows? I've been surprised before. There are definitely some writers and authors out there who are able to produce prolifically and at the same time make incredible work. But the epilogue ends with them walking with the 6 pilgrims walking towards the Shrike and the Time Tombs. And I don't know if it's Hoyt or Linnae or Weintraub who starts whistling this tune. But they start whistling this tune and someone's like, oh, that's from a film back in like the early 20th century. It's like 1,000 years old. And I guess it's, and I don't know, it's kind of a spoiler to tell you, but there's no reason for me not to. There's still, the way that he describes this is impeccable, and I really think that it's worth reading. But it ends up that he's whistling, we're off to see the wizard, the wonderful Wizard of Oz. And it's this really dark and macabre way to end this book, because we as people know that the Shrike represents retribution. There's a reason that the individuals who worship the Shrike possess the cruciform. There's a reason that the Shrike Church, believes what it does. There's a reason that Simmons does all these things. And I think it's because the Shrike is supposed to kind of represent this similar thing to what Jesus represents in the Christian faith, or what a savior represents in any faith, of redemption, but flipped on its head, of retribution. Because the reality is that we're not worthy of redemption. We're worthy of retribution. If you look at the grand scheme of like balance, right? And that's a big thing that Simmons is kind of making a point about in the novel as a whole, is that like humans have refused or been unable to evolve into something new. And even the things that are based off of them end up perpetuating these specific kinds of norms that are just not advantageous to sincerity, not advantageous to the perpetuation of the existence of other things. And so the Shrike represents this like harsh, unfeeling, unmoving retribution inevitably. Like this inevitable retribution, just like time is inevitable, right? And it's literally even a counteraction of time. The Time Tombs, the place where it exists, is antithetical to our perception of one of the most intrinsic aspects of reality, and that is time. And so, in that same capacity, it is representative and antithetical to one of our most intrinsic understandings of religion, of why we are important as beings in the universe. It's basically saying we're not, and we deserve to be destroyed because of it, because we've made ourselves out to be something that we aren't. And so the Shrike represents like this antithesis of everything that we believe, but at the same time is a fullness of existence and sincerity that we are incapable of having. It's an absolution of certain aspects of reality that we cannot comprehend, in the same way that like a god would be. And so for them to be whistling and singing the tune, we're off to see the wizard, the wonderful Wizard of Oz, because of the wonderful things that he does, is just really profound. I found myself having to like pause and be like, is this really how this book is going to end? Because. In some capacity, it seems as if through the mindfulness of learning the stories of every other individual, through the practice of like learning the stories of the other people who are in the group, some aspect of humanity has been transcended by these people, where they realize that their unique experience in this trauma or this thing that has driven them through their entire lives to this specific point is not simply unique to them. that other things around them exist in ways that are just as sincere and authentic as their own ways of existence. And they have to acknowledge that, like, that's the only way to move forward. And then, of course, you can take, in addition to that, like, Dorothy is the only female character in that movie of import, other than, like, the Wicked Witch of the West and the fairy woman, or the good witch, or whatever that she goes by. I can't remember off the top of my head, and for that I apologize. But Glinda, I think, is her name. But they're the only two people that exist. And in some capacity, we kind of get that in Kassad's story with the woman that he interacts with, right? I think that, like, you know, we have the Tin Man, the Lion, the Scarecrow, and Dorothy, which is only 5. We don't have 6, or we don't have 7 or even 6. We kind of get Toto in the form of, like, Weintraub's daughter. But I think that the point isn't for it to be a direct reference by, like, you know, as much factual reference as possible or as many thematic elements as possible. I think that the point of the reference is to say that, like, every human being is heartless and mindless and fearful and reprehensible and just not desirable in some capacity. And we make ourselves out to be the protagonists of our story in some capacity, as if we're the most important things. The universe revolves around us. And in the same way that the Shrike is antithetical to everything else that I mentioned, now the whole universe revolves around it. Revolves around Hyperion. Revolves around something decidedly not human. Because it is the antithesis of everything that is human. Because it doesn't exist in any relative form. It exists in absolution. It exists outside of the axioms that we believe ourselves to be able to comprehend, and therefore is more real than we ourselves are able to believe ourselves as being. Especially when you give us more technology and more tools, we get less and less real. We start to kind of fall into that, like, area of predictive science fiction where, you know, you can travel to any world instantaneously. So why is travel special? You can absorb information almost instantaneously. So why is the process of it special? Everything that we believe is valuable can be undermined by a desire for easier consumption, a desire for profit, a desire for something else. And that's what Simmons is. I think that's the whole point of all of these books. I haven't read the other ones, but I imagine that that's kind of what he's going to get at, is, like, you know, the antithesis of human is reality. Humans don't exist in a real way in the same capacity that things outside of us exist. And we attempt to categorize it via all of these means and symbolic interactions that ultimately are dictated by the fact that we think ourselves to be the center of the universe when we really aren't. So I think that's kind of Simmons' point, is that things just kind of are around us, and the only reason that they seem important to us is because ultimately we believe ourselves to be important. And what happens if we really weren't that important? What now? So I think that is kind of the point of the first book, is to set that tone. And so as we go into the next few books, I'm thinking that we're going to get a lot more of that. We're also going to get more conclusions, more like plot and more science fiction-y stuff, because we're not so much in, like, this ethereal metaphor or allegory that's being told through a science fiction lens. So that's all I've got for you guys this week. I know it was a little heavy. I would apologize, but I'm not sorry. I hope that you guys enjoyed this particular episode and enjoyed me talking about the first book of Hyperion. I look forward to talking about the second one on the next episode. And thank you so much for joining me today. Make sure you leave us a nice 5-star review if you like us. Hit that subscribe button. And if you haven't read this book yet, please do. I really recommend it. It is definitely one of those books that kind of takes you further and further and further away from that which you believe to be normal, and then finally says, hey, turn around, and you see behind you the trail of destruction that humanity has caused in some capacity, and you suddenly become mindful of your role in that, in at least some small way. So, and that's really important for us to acknowledge, especially during the things that are going on around us right now, is to acknowledge that there is a pernicious, intrinsic nature to humans that solicits destruction, whether or not that destruction is, in fact, more often than not, that destruction is not justified. So, again, thank you for joining me this week. I'll be back on Wednesday to talk about something else or the next book. And again, I hope you guys enjoyed the discussion on Hyperion. Thanks. Have a good day.
You've been listening to the Golden State Media Concepts Sci-Fi Podcast, part of the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. You can find this show and others like it at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Download our podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, and Google Play. Just type in GSMC to find all the shows from the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network, from movies to music, from sports to entertainment, and even weird news. You can also follow us on Twitter and on Facebook. Thank you, and we hope you have enjoyed today's program.